The book of Hebrews has a very interesting image of the cross. The way it portrays the cross, Christ's sufferings. In the book of Hebrews, you have this idea that Christ tasted death for everyone. And you find this in chapter 2 of Hebrews. Basically, this passage is between verses 9 and 15. I'm not reading the whole thing. There are a couple of verses there with some details, not important right now. So I highlighted the key things, especially things in red. They're the key things. So let me just read that. But we see Jesus, who was made a little lower than the angels. Now, if you just read the previous few verses, the author of the Hebrews is actually reflecting upon a psalm that says that humans are made little lower than angels. So in other words, basically what he's saying here is Jesus was made human being. Jesus, who was made a little lower than the angels for the suffering of death, crowned with glory and honor, that he, by the grace of God, might taste death for everyone. What does it mean? What does it mean that he tasted death for everyone? Commonly, I hear the context of this, the sentiment of these texts similar to this in the New Testament, is that there is some kind of punishment inflicted upon Christ on the cross. That was punishment by the Father that was inflicted upon Christ on the cross. Well, the first thing, the context here is not punishment or transaction, but the grace of God. It says that he, by the grace of God, might taste that for everyone. Grace, the Greek word charis, which means gift. Now, gifts do not imply any kind of transaction, business transactions. Gifts are unconditional. That is their nature. It's not really a transactional image where you have things scaled on a balance and you have transactions between the two. It's a gift. By the gift of God, he tasted that for everyone. But what does that mean? What does that mean? Well, this is something that Christ has chosen to do. And we read that this was the gift of God to everyone. That he tasted that for everyone. This was a gift from God. A free gift, unconditional gift to everyone. All those who will accept it, of course. And then you continue to read, inasmuch then as the children have partaken of flesh and blood, he himself likewise shared in the same. So again, he was made the human being. That is the point that the author of the book of Hebrews is saying here. He was made a human being. He himself likewise shared in flesh and blood. Why? That through death he might destroy him who had the power of death, that is the devil, and release those who through fear of death were all their lifetime subject to bondage. Now, if you just read verse 9 in chapter 2, it says that he tasted that. In fact, if you just read this phrase, he tasted that for everyone. That's how people read it. Unfortunately, sometimes, and they just say, "Oh yeah, he's been punished by God, and God inflicted the death of every single human being upon him, and there was a transaction, so we don't have to experience this." I don't really read that in this passage. First, in verse 9 itself, the context is not transaction, but is the gift of God, the grace of God. So this, him experiencing that, is a gift of God to humankind. Secondly, not just the verse, that's super immediate context, but the immediate context of the passage, the couple of texts before and after, you find here. So why did he taste that? There is actually an answer if you just read a couple of verses down. Yeah, it wasn't that he was punished by God. There's something else going on here. He was actually taking charge on the cross through tasting death. When you read the rest of the passage, you get an impression that he was hanging there like a weak, helpless victim who was inflicted death upon him. No. You read that he, by the grace of God, by the gift of God, he chose to taste that for everyone. Why? That, if you read the second part in red, that through that he might destroy him who had the power of that. That is the devil. Okay. So here, even though Jesus tasted that, he was not the victim of that. He was in charge all the while through the process of his suffering. He was always in charge. And he always told his disciples, yes, I can call 12 legions of angels. Yes, I can. Well, he could have come down from the cross as they tempted him to do. He could have done all these things. It was his choice that he would suffer and taste that. Why? Well, the explanation we are given in this passage, there is an answer, is that through that he might destroy the devil. Okay? So, the context of this passage is not the punishment of Christ, but it is the grace of God or the gift of God through which Christ tastes that for everyone so that he may destroy him who has the power of that, that he may destroy death itself. That is the ultimate point of the passage. The ultimate enemy of God is death. That is what you read, I think, in Paul's epistles, Corinthians, someplace, that the last enemy to be destroyed is death. That is the ultimate enemy that God will destroy. It's not his friend. That is not God's friend. It's not part of God's plan to have death in this world, either of humans or animals. This is part of the problem. So we are given the answer here. And what you find here, you don't see this two-dimensional interpretation of the cross that's all over the place. Most people that I hear, most books I read, it just talks about this. They're just God and Christ, like the Father and Christ, like Christ wasn't God himself. God and Christ, and there is some kind of punishment or separation between the two, and that's it. So there are just two parties. But no, you have three parties here on the cross. You have God, you have Christ, and you have the devil. So it's a three-dimensional drama taking place here. And this is consistent with what you read at the beginning of the Bible. And you should read this text also in the context of the entire Bible, not just in the context of verse 9 or Hebrews chapter 2, but the entire Bible, because when you go back to the beginning of the story, again, there are three parties there in the Garden of Eden. Not just God and humans. No. You have God, humans, and the serpent or Satan or the devil. So again, you have three-dimensional conflict and mess, and that's what it is. There are not just two, there are three players there, three parties, three actors in the drama. Okay, so the context that we read about in this passage first is the grace of God, which means it's a gift of God. So you're not talking about transaction. You make payment instead. You make payment for somebody else. That's not gift. If you make any kind of payments, and it's a business transaction. You scratch my back, I'll scratch your back. With the gifts, it's not like that. Gifts are unconditional. Here, it's yours. You don't owe me anything. Now you're free to take the gift or leave it, but there are no strings attached. You don't owe anything. That is a gift. The second context, when you read it further, is the victory of Christ. The victory of Christ. So the context is here, Christ is not presented as the victim on the cross. Very clearly, he is presented as the victor on the cross. He's been victorious over The devil who holds the power of death. He was victorious over the devil and over death. That was what Christ has achieved on the cross. How exactly this works? Well, please do have a look at the series of presentations called Jesus on the Cross, at the center of the war between good and evil, about 5 parts series. Please have a look at that, and we're going into this story in much more detail, taking it from the beginning of the Bible all the way to the end of the Bible. Okay, in the final context, that through death he might destroy him who had the power of death, that is the devil. And now read the end bit. And release those who through fear of death were all their lifetime subject to bondage. So 2 keywords: bondage and release. Bondage and release. Liberation, in other words. Slavery and liberation. This is the final context. Slavery and liberation. And in this series, Jesus on the Cross, in part 2 called Liberation, I talk about this and look at this idea of liberation from the beginning to the end of the Bible. This is the context that the Hebrews is giving us also. Release from bondage, liberation from slavery. Okay, so this is really the context. There is no mention of any kind of punishment, infliction of punishment on Christ, any kind of transactional image. You have the images of the gift of God, victory of Christ over Satan and death, and somehow the idea of liberation, where we are released from bondage to death and to fear of death. This is what you find in the book of Hebrews. And really, if you read the entire Bible in context, from the beginning to the end, if you read this wide context, complete context of the story of God and humanity and battle between good and evil, this fits really perfectly. It's really consistent, this passage, with the entire story you read in the Bible. And it's very clear what is happening here. Christ is the victor over his enemy, the devil, and the ultimate enemy, the death. And this was all Christ's choice. He didn't have to do this. He has come to do this. He became human, little lower than angel. He shared in our flesh and blood, and it was a gift. He didn't have to do it. It was the gift from God, the grace of God, to give us freedom from fear of death, fear and death, to liberate us and give us new life through Jesus Christ. That is what God has done for us on the cross.